Hello, everyone, and welcome to this exciting event brought to you by the Modern Criminal Law Initiative at the University of Toronto and the Institute of Criminology at the University of Sydney, Australia. It's a great pleasure to be hosting this event and co-moderating with my colleague, Dr. Chris Wilson.
Thanks, Ali. In this panel session, we'll be discussing the new edited collection, Decolonizing the Criminal Law, Colonial Legacies, Contemporary Problems. And our panel is made up of the co-editors of this wonderful new collection. But before we begin with introductions, I'd first like to take the opportunity to acknowledge country, which is an important practice here in Australia, where Ali and I are joining you from. Acknowledgements of country are a modern form of a practice dating back thousands of years that facilitated the identification and positioning of individuals within Aboriginal Australian ontological legal orders as they traversed, traded, and interacted across boundaries and borders. It's a process that remains important today to recognise that the cultures, practices, and legal orders of First Peoples continue to hold value and resonance alongside imposed colonial legal orders, a particularly relevant consideration given our subject today. So in that spirit, I, as a descendant of the Arabana and Diri peoples of Kaditunda Lake Eyre in central South Australia, acknowledge that we're moderating in this digital space from the lands of the Gadigal peoples of the Eora Nation, upon whose ancestral lands both my university and Ali's university now stand here in Sydney. I'd also like to pay respect to elders, both past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land, again, particularly attuned to the important history of this specific land upon which we are broadcasting from, has always been a place for knowledge sharing amongst the peoples of what is today known as the Sydney Basin. And we also pass that respect to traditional custodians of land wherever you all are in the world. So with that, my name is Chris Wilson. I'm a lecturer at the University of Technology, Sydney. I teach criminal law, property law, and Indigenous people in the law. And I'm here with my wonderful colleague, Ali. Over to you, Ali.
Thank you to my wonderful colleague, Chris. And it's really a pleasure to be doing this together. I'm Ali Luffman, Professor of Criminal Law and Criminal Law Theory here at the University of Sydney. And together, Chris and I are going to be moderating our event today. We are going to hear from each of the panelists, and it's my pleasure to introduce them to you now. Anna Aliverti is Professor of Law at the University of Warwick in the United Kingdom. Her work covers criminal justice, border control regimes, and their intersections. Henrique Carvalho is Reader in Law and co-director of the Criminal Justice Centre at the University of Warwick in the United Kingdom. He works on social theories of law, punishment, and justice. Anastasia Chamberlen. Anna Chamberlen is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Warwick, UK. Her research covers themes around gender, prisons and punishment, and the arts in criminal justice. And Maximo Zozo is Professor of Sociology of Law and Criminology at the National University of Litoral in Argentina. Thank you, everyone, for being part of this event. Each presenter will have about 10 minutes to introduce their material, and then we'll open up for questions in the final part of our time together. For those watching on the live YouTube feed, Chris and I will be monitoring the chat and selecting questions to put to the panel. So feel free to post your questions as we go. And now, without further delay, it gives me great pleasure to pass over to Anna Aliverti, who'll be introducing us to the book. Thank you, Anna.
So thank you very much, Arlie, Chris, and Marcus Duver, who is behind the scenes for this invitation. We are delighted to be here sharing our project and also presenting the rich work that many authors produce and are the main content of this book. We are, and many of the authors might be here today, and we are really grateful for their work and helping us with this project. So this collection engages with debates within criminology about matters of colonial power, which have come to be conceptualized through the language of decolonization. In many ways, these efforts are not new. as far back as the 1970s and 80s, significant critical contributions introduced the connection between colonialism and the criminal question to better understand contemporary processes of social control and rethink their foundations. So Stan Cohen, Rosa Delormo, Raul Zaffaroni, all argue that colonialism in its different forms had contributed to reproducing the dependence and submission of peripheral countries with respect to those at the center, both in the production of knowledge and in the institutions and practices of social control. In recent years, however, there has been an increasing and sustained interest in this connection, with an exponential growth of scholarship advocating for and advancing counter-colonial, post-colonial, decolonial, and southern criminological perspectives. Such work denounced the many silences and absences in the field of knowledge, criticizing what Chris Cunning has sharply characterized in the opening chapter of this book as criminological innocence. This active process of unknowing and ignorance has been reproduced in vast sectors of the criminological field up to the present, including in its teaching. This collaborative project builds on such work while expanding conceptual and methodological tools to uncover the coloniality of crime, criminal justice, and social control more broadly, and reflects on their implications for doing research in these areas. We decided to frame the subject of this collective project using the idea of the criminal question that was coined by Italian critical criminologists in the 70s and 80s. In giving conceptual depth to this expression, Tamar Peach pointed out more than 25 years ago that to study criminal question is different from studying crime. It means crime is not considered independently from the procedures by which it is defined, the instruments deployed in its administration and control, and the politics and debates around criminal justice and public order. In other words, the idea of the criminal question foregrounds the breadth and politics of criminal knowledge. When, how, why, by whom, and with respect to whom certain behaviors are effectively defined as crime in social life become fundamental interrogations, as does the question of how such a selective process has shaped the study of crime and punishment. Decolonizing the criminal question for us involves shedding light on the colonial legacies underpinning the structures of inequality, injustice, and domination, with their various racist, classist, and patriarchal axes in the functioning not only of social control institutions, but also of academia. It means not only looking back and looking south, but also, as the contributors of this volume suggest, understanding how ideas and concepts travel in a sort of imperial feedback loop, which is fundamental for appreciating contemporary global dynamics and beyond the frame of the nation state. Above all, it entails breaking open these frameworks and exploring actors, institutions, discourses, practices with fresh eyes, questioning northern hegemonies through new methodological and empirical lenses. So the project aims at tracing the multiple impacts of colonialism on the dynamics of knowledge production of the criminal question, scrutinizing the multifaceted relations between colonialism and social control, institutions, processes, and practices, with the aim of exposing recurring processes of racialization and marginalization of diverse groups in both South and North. And also, and importantly, it seeks to track, elaborate, and expand on the different forms of resistance and struggle against colonialism in the field of criminal question, both in terms of knowledge and action and the construction of decolonial alternatives. So the project has a number of ambitions. First, it aspires to take stock and reconstruct critical traditions through efforts done by others. It maps the intellectual richness of the work being done within and beyond this field of studies. and sketches a way forward that foregrounds the theoretical, methodological, political, and ethical insights to craft an emancipatory program of research and action. We believe and hope that this dialogue across disciplines among scholars working in the Global South and the North not only deepens the critical potential of the project, but provides much needed intellectual freshness and vitality to a field stagnated by tired and inadequate conceptual, methodological, and theoretical frameworks. Now I will invite Máximo first, and then Henrique and Anastasia to discuss the main contributions of the project.
Well, thank you, Anna. Thank you, Arlie, Chris, and Marcus for the invitation. I am very happy to be here this afternoon here in Argentina. As Anna said, we think this project of decolonizing the criminal question as a multifaceted, multidimensional project, a very complex one that have very different avenues in which the literature in the last years have been developing different tools in order to advance. We try to, at the end of the book, in a concluding chapter, try to wrap up these different avenues. And one that we think is very important and that we try to highlight is the activity of problematizing and dismantling dynamics of hierarchization, subordination, and dependence in knowledge production on the criminal question. If we look back at the emergence of criminological discourse at the end of the 19th century, we can find that it is absolutely clear how the process of medicalization and pathologization of the criminal question that the positivist criminologists, the criminologists working through a positivist epistemology and methodology has produced was constructed hand in hand with the edification of inequalities in knowledge production and circulation across the globe. And it was strongly connected, as many authors in the book have shown. For example, John Moore in the second chapter of the book, with broader processes of colonization and neocolonization through its connection with practices of governance, exploitation, and domination. Since that moment, in the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, these relations of hierarchization, subordination, and dependence in knowledge production on the criminal question were constructed. So, and were sustained through different kinds of intellectual styles of knowledge production. In the metropolis, in the north, in the center, the intellectual production around the criminal question in some way assume, as take it for granted, the universality of problems, concepts, arguments that were constructed in those spaces and in those times, eroding their specificities or particularities connected precisely with those geographical and historical coordinates. And in the other sense, in the colonies or ex-colonies, in the south, in the peripheries, the style of intellectual production was in some way connected with a critical importation of these concepts, arguments, problems as universals. And in that sense, the intellectuals in the peripheries, the south, the ex-colonies or colonies, became producers of empirical data that in some way establish the universality of the intellectual production in the privileged areas of the world. The framework was more a framework of application of theory testing, and instead of theory building. So this construction of relations of hierarchy, subordination, and dependence between different parts of the globe that was built in the transition between the 19th and the 20th century and around the positivist criminology was not questioned or destroyed by the theoretical mutations that criminology experienced throughout the 20th century. If we think in the first half of the 20th century and the ascendance of sociological criminology from the United States, from the Chicago School of Sociology onwards, these new theoretical vocabularies didn't put into question this hierarchy, subordination, and dependence. There were, of course, different centers that emerged as the main sources of influence for theoretically thinking around the criminal question. This has been also in some way reinforced through the strong process of institutionalization of criminology, particularly in the United States of America and in the UK in the second half of the 20th century, in comparison with many other places of the world, and to some extent also in other English-speaking countries like Canada or Australia. So at the beginning of the 1960s and 70s, when the many different versions of critical theory emerged in the field, there was a very, let's say, paradoxical situation. Everybody was going in a critical direction, but at the same time, these relations of hierarchization, subordination, and dependence between different parts of the world in the production and circulation of knowledge were not questioned. So we have to also recognize that it's true that the first isolated voices that produced the first problematizations of these relations emerged from these critical traditions. So Anna mentioned the names of Cohen in the English-speaking world, Stanley Cohen from the UK. We can add also the names of Del Olmo or Zaffaroni from Latin America. But it is only in the last decade or so in which we are really witnessing a really growth of this activity of problematizing this kind of relations. So of course, for us, decolonizing the criminal question implies questioning these hierarchies, these practices of subordination and dependency, and produce concrete steps towards dismantling it. But we have also to not to forget the importance of material and structural conditions. These relations of subordination, dependency, and hierarchy are not only built through intellectual styles, ways of thinking, but also are built through inequalities in the availability of resources to do social research in different parts of the world. So for us, dismantling these relations means first to restore the activity of making a history of the discourses on the criminal question in the peripheral contexts. We think that this is particularly important because we can find through a very detailed history of these discourses in this peripheral context also episodes of resistance to the subordination and dependency, and the production of theoretical innovation from the periphery, from the south. And we think that locating these experiences, these episodes, is very, very important, not only in fighting against amnesia, as David Rodriguez Goches and Nigel South label it, but also because we think these episodes, these experiences could be also sources of inspiration for our present. And we think that this has to be combined with situating knowledge on the criminal question produced in the north, in the center, in the metropolis, revealing the limits of its scope. Mark Brown, who has made the foreword of the book, recently has called for the provincialization of the intellectual production of central context on the criminal question. We think that this needs to be built through a deep immersion on the peripheral context through plural methodological ways in order to decenter the perspectives that came from the center and rejecting an attitude of application. This is very, very difficult to do. It's much more easier to say it. Looking from the periphery is very challenging. And of course, in doing this, we think that we will still use a lot of elements coming from the center, from the north, from the metropolis, but contesting other elements, selecting them in a sort of syncretic search. And in this syncretic search, we also think there is an important role for other traditions of thought beyond what is recognized as scientific in the center or in the north. So, for example, in one of the chapters of the book by Lucía Braco from Peru, she uses very interesting ideas about ayllu and mestizaje, two concepts that came respectively from the Spanish, the second one, and the first one from the languages of the Aboriginal people in Peru, in order to think about the practices of building solidarity inside women prisons in Peru between women. So I think this is a very interesting example of how the connection with other traditions of thought can give us elements to rethink what we are trying to understand. And also, there are other examples in the book that are very interesting, like Amanda Wilson discussion about the meaning of healing in the therapeutic jurisprudence and the distance of this meaning from the tradition of different indigenous people in different parts of the world. Of course, this is a very difficult and complex path, but we think that this book and the excellent work that has been made by many of the authors show us that it is possible and that we can advance in this direction. Thank you. So then I pass the floor to Henrique.
Thank you, Maximo. And again, just to reiterate, thank you to Ali, Chris, and Marcus for this very kind invitation. Very nice for us to be able to have this conversation in what probably is a really important and troublesome moment to engage with this, but perhaps only makes it more necessary. So I'm going to just talk about another element of our concluding chapter that ties some of the threads of the collection together. And this section highlights this, what perhaps is a very central problem in decolonial scholarship, which this collection highlights quite well, which is how do we trace and understand the development of colonial legacies and their influence on contemporary conditions and dynamics? Basically, how do we link past and present to make the past relevant to the present, but also to, well, to some extent, prevent just a focus on the past from colonizing the present. All right. So the precise character and shape that these effects, the effects that a colonial past especially can have on present conditions, can vary very significantly depending on the context, depending on the perspective. And this is one thing that we feel the collection has been able to scrutinize and reflect quite well. But perhaps the main trope in scholarship in this field is that of persistence, as it seeks to uncover and highlight the enduring influence of a colonial or imperial past on contemporary conditions and dynamics, the persistence of the past on the present, basically. Focus here is primarily on tracing the debris left by colonialism and on uncovering the colonial and imperial formations that inhabit and condition the present, whose influence is often obscured, if not actively denied, by dominant discourses and representations to bring the past out into the present. In so doing, this approach seeks to expose the deep roots of the criminal question and thus challenge the idea that it is possible to properly understand contemporary problems without a significant and critical engagement with their colonial underpinnings. The chapter by Rodriguez Santos in the collection offers a compelling illustration of this kind of archaeological work, depicting the persistent othering and subjugation of Black and indigenous populations in Brazil, in spite of shifts in law, politics, and policy. He argues that this structural violence is likely to be perpetuated unless proper efforts are made to uproot its basis, a problem which is aptly captured by the common saying which he uses as the title of one of his chapter sections. Brasil tem enorme passado pela frente. Brazil has a huge past ahead of itself. This theme can also ground the genealogical approach, evidencing how issues that are deemed to be new and contemporary reveal themselves as reiterations of practices and processes which are with a much longer history. For instance, in Gabriel's chapter, there is an insightful discussion of how the notion of border criminality, which has become one of the defining aspects of crime control and scholarship in the 21st century, can be linked to colonial practices as far back as the 19th century. This predominant theme in this book, as well as in scholarship more broadly, presses us to see coloniality as a living and in many ways dominant force shaping contemporary power relations, structural inequalities and lived experiences, not just in so-called post-colonial societies, but also in the former colonial metropolis, both in relation to marginalized populations and elite setting, and also elite settings, as some chapters in the collection highlight, such as the chapter by Earl, Palmer, and Phillips that talks about racialization in criminology and the persistence of race in criminological thinking, but also in terms of the epistemological coloniality existing in academia, as in Blount Hill and Agil's chapter in the volume. This issue also urges us to recognize the partial, limited, and exclusionary character of hegemonic understandings of historical and contemporary conditions and dynamics, rescuing what has been omitted and suppressed by dominant discourses and narratives. It thus highlights the need for counter-narratives as part of a decolonial project, as exemplified by Agostino's chapter in the collection. While a focus on persistent elements of structures is necessary for an understanding of coloniality, a different but equally valuable approach calls our attention to shifts and transformations in colonial matrices of power, scrutinizing how coloniality can take different shapes and lead to new relations of exploitation and subjection. Several contributions in the collection illustrate different ways in which this insight can be mobilized. For instance, Collard shows how techniques of torture developed in a colonial setting can then be exported as a form of expertise to ground new forms of exploitation and subjection in post-colonial scenarios, like in Argentina, as her chapter discusses. Harris's chapter, in turn, explores how a colonial legacy can be transformed in a post-colonial setting, permutating in ways that blur the lines between colonized and colonizer, where the colonized can become colonizer in a different setting. In her case, in the case of her chapter in Malaysia. Similar insights can be found in O'Reilly's examination of Cape Verde's strategic use of colonial ties and geopolitical position to craft its leadership in policing matters in Africa, or in Wasim's elaboration of the post-colonial condition of policing in Pakistan and Nigeria, and its interrogation in the light of social unrest and public protest. This theme of transmutation, of the transmutation of colonial features as exemplified in the aforementioned interventions, highlights how colonial legacies are replete with new connections and discontinuities. And in this sense, it adds a significant new dimension of inquiry to the theme of persistence, as it analyzes not only what has remained the same, but also and mainly what has changed, but in a way that nevertheless remains related to and conditioned by colonial and imperial formations. We feel that a decolonial project needs to be keenly attentive to these metamorphoses and permutations of coloniality, to be fully aware of the pervasiveness and in many ways the inescapability of colonial and imperial duress in contemporary structures and institutions, particularly those related to the criminal question. It also raises an important issue of specificity, right? That we need to resist the temptation to universalize coloniality as a singular force, and to also understand that it is something dynamic, something alive, that shifts and changes, not only depending on context and specificity, but also depending on perspective. And it can create many different layers of coloniality. So the allure of essentialism is always present, especially given the influence of universalistic and totalizing perspectives in fields such as criminology and law. But a decolonial effort, therefore, requires an inherent dialectical lens, which can recognize the uniqueness of experience at the same time as it can acknowledge the connections and relations embedded in it. Perhaps the last cautionary point that we make in this section of the introduction is that although we need to acknowledge this persistent, multifaceted, deep force of coloniality into the present, we should resist also a temptation that see coloniality simply in everything. All right, we should not reduce coloniality to a universalistic source, but rather the issue of highlighting coloniality in the present should guide us to locate and explore how it is part of a complex and fluid tapestry in which colonial and imperial legacies react against and interact with other tendencies, structures, and processes. For instance, many chapters in the collection, such as hierarchies and Wasim's, show how colonial debris can fuse with things like nationalism in post-colonial settings to give rise to new dynamics of criminalization, racialization, and exclusion. I think I'll stop here and pass over to Anastasia Chamberlen for.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this invitation to come and talk about the collection. So I will briefly try and reflect on some of the methodological implications that emerged out of this project and out of the different chapters in the collection, and kind of try and wrap kind of a summary of how we might proceed to attempt to decolonize future projects in criminology and criminal justice. So all of the chapters in the collection have called for a more robustly critical glance at penal power and injustice and at oppression and structural violence more broadly. And they have all, I think, also invited us to put at the center of our investigations the lived experiences of racialized and marginalized populations that are at the heart of the colonial legacies that they investigated. The authors in the book propose that we commit to a methodological alertness that has us more regularly question what, how, and where we're seeking to decolonize. At the heart of this methodological endeavor to decolonize, we argue there is a kind of a unique reflexivity that gets us to rethink both our thinking, our position, and our research practices. It might be called a kind of a particularly decolonial reflexivity. So I'll try and unpack what we mean by that a little bit. So first, the authors in the collection have challenged the conceptual limits and intellectual frontiers of the project of criminology as a plural field and discipline, and they question criminology as a discipline in itself, not only due to its colonial underpinnings and complex history, but also due to its enduring narrow-mindedness that has confined certain concepts, including that of crime itself, as John Moore discusses in his chapter in the collection, but also the notion of punishment, as Gail Super shows in her chapter. So they ask us to rethink some of these central concepts in the field of criminology and think of different ways to work with them. The authors in the book rethink these notions by taking a Southern lens or looking at this from a subaltern context. They argue that doing so will not only shed light on what is happening at the periphery, but will also get us to revisit how we analyze what is happening at the center too. A methodologically attuned decolonial project then gets us to question the hegemonic status of established ground narratives in the field of criminology and criminal justice. And these are notions and concepts that have dominated the field and have gone largely unquestioned for too long. Authors in the book invite us to demystify and demythologize these Eurocentric theories and standpoints, and they ask us to remain careful and reflexive of the travel of knowledge production and to subvert ground theorizing by being attentive to the local, cultural, discursive, and geopolitical nuances of their research studies. Of course, doing so necessitates also a more serious commitment to historical specificity. So archival and historiographical approaches are also central to some of the author's scholarship, And this can offer, they argue, a more concrete historical accountability to the long legacies of colonialism. Second, the authors in the book invite us to be reflexive not only of our sources of knowledge, but also of our own status and privilege. This includes attention to our professional status at elite spaces and institutions, as Blonde, Hill, and Agil show in their chapter about early career academics experiences in the global north. But attention to our status also includes paying attention to our relationships with our research participants as well. All this in turn suggests an intellectual responsibility for those with status and privilege to share more, open up more, be more aware of their own power, and to be at the forefront of unsettling power and institutional dynamics that maintain intellectual imbalances in the production of knowledge. But to go back to the question of research participants, the chapter by Rod Earle, Appa Palmer, and Coretta Phillips, for instance, highlight how positionality and biography, those of the researcher and of the researched, can impact the kinds of data we collect and the analysis that we give to such data. This is especially pertinent in the context of decolonizing efforts, where the power imbalances between researcher and researched can and have often been shaped by colonial power imbalances, and unless resisted, can maintain ongoing oppressive structures and dynamics. The chapters in the book also get us to admit the discipline's own limits. So the collection's ethos and search for underexplored areas and themes has led us to collaborate with a number of scholars new to our own professional networks and individuals who work beyond or are in the margins, we might say, of criminology. In these encounters, we found interesting synergies and connected with people that we wouldn't otherwise have done if we stayed in our own intellectual silos. We engage with historians like Sarah Gabriel, legal scholars like Rodriguez Santos, and with criminologists who are willing to engage with transdisciplinary scholarship and ideas. These are criminologists willing to admit that progress in our own discipline has been slow and are open to the advances made elsewhere, culturally, geographically, and intellectually. These scholars are equally open to conceptual and political inspirations that go hand in hand with those of decolonial and post-colonial efforts, including, for instance, feminist epistemologies or other recent sociological advances in arts-based, live, and creative methods that put at the center, at the core of their scholarship, the affective complexity of lived experiences, seeking to humanize research participants within a concrete ethics of care that is clear about its politics and about the side it takes in the spectacles of geopolitical violence. These approaches are also clear about the transformative and often even abolitionist stances they take in relation to criminal justice institutions. A decolonial lens then ought not only to map colonial legacies and continuities, but to also acknowledge the different forms of experience this take. A decolonial approach, we would argue, should be open to more and be more phenomenological, intersectional, embodied, and should also take account of a feminist epistemology too. These accounts of life are central for us in unsettling the peripheries of colonialism, but also those of criminalization. But perhaps even more importantly, these approaches, as Lucia Bracco's chapter highlights, offer us an opportunity to also see the resistances that take place in these spaces of continued colonization. So in her chapter that focused on women's experiences in Peru's largest women's prison, she engages actively with the various strategies of resistance that women adopt in prison. And these are strategies that actually help them offer opportunities for solidarity and collective organization on a political level. As also shown by the chapters by Sarah Gabriel and Zohar Basim, resistance to oppressive structure is ongoing and central to peripheral context, and can show also the impact of social movements in these areas too. Attention to this is central to bringing about perhaps incremental but radical change. Attention to such resistant narratives is also a political act in itself. As O'Reilly remarks in his chapter, we ought to be careful to avoid falling into patronizing narratives that devoid colonized actors of their earned power. Other chapters in the book attend to the intimate connections between decolonial and feminist approaches too, and of course, Biko Agostino's longstanding work in this area and his chapter in the collection is a good example of this, as is also Lucy Harris's work on the intimate patriarchal and colonial dynamics of punishment in Malaysia. The dialogue between these two perspectives, the feminist and the decolonial, needs to be further invested in. If these methodologies are employed together, they hold the promise to concretize, visualize, embody, and voice untold and marginalized stories, lived experiences, and complex but also contradictory accounts that ought not to be essentialized or boxed into binary Cartesian models of normative thinking. Finally, a decolonial methodology needs to remain sensitive to questions of where. We have sought to include chapters in this collection that not only theorize about the colonial contours of the criminal question, but also empirically map and investigate this across the globe. Many of the authors come from the settings they research and can offer culturally sensitive and nuanced insights from the South, challenging the long history of criminological work on the other, questioning also the anthropological allure to exceptionalize, exoticize, and infantilize non-Western peoples and contexts. Our authors achieved this by rejecting the tendency, as Amanda Wilson in her chapter on drug courts and therapeutic jurisprudence highlights, to adopt the savior mentality. This attention to positionality and proximity is perhaps key for a decolonial approach to the criminal question. Thank you. I'll pass on to Anna.
Thank you. So I'm going to kind of briefly make some remarks on the last aspect of the conclusion, which is on politics and ethics, and wrap up, so we can have some time for questions. So we understand that the decolonizing project has politics and ethics at its heart. Decolonization is not a metaphor, but is concrete and grounded. It is both intellectual and a political movement concerned with theory and practice, in the same way that radical feminists and abolitionists have approach it. One key strand of the project then is to particularly investigate the locus of power and the relationship between modern state formation, colonization, and capitalism, the structural basis of social control apparatus. So from Brazil to Colombia to South Africa, Israel, Pakistan, and Nigeria, the chapters of Rodriguez Santos, Itarralde, Super, Ravid, Wassim, respectively, explore how modern state formation have been highly anchored to corporate interest, and in turn how such relationship continues to shape contemporary practice and institutions of social control. So when we discuss politics, we also imply the broader political process involved in decolonization, which aims at dismantling global material and cultural inequalities, but also building up new ones. By exploring the mundane but creative practices of care and solidarity by ordinary people around the world, the project seeks to retrieve grassroots radical interventions built on interaction, collaboration, and contestation from below. And for this, in particular, the chapters by Agostino, Bracco Bruce, and Canning are particularly important. And the project involves us all as researchers and interrogate us as ethical beings. As the contribution of the volume argues, such tasks require profound changes to the way criminological knowledge is constructed. It's not about adding books to the reading list, to borrow from John Moore chapter, or glittering healing in the criminal apparatus, or the criminological lexicon, what Amanda Wilson in her chapter suggests many restorative justice interventions amount to. It is a task that demands systemic changes to the geographies and identities and in and of criminology, and our active engagement in the inequalities that produce this field and this field producing in terms of teaching, research, funding, structures, and models, international collaborations. Blount-Hill and Agile in particular point to the importance of being mindful of the cognitive imperialism that characterizes criminology as discipline premise on the distinction between the researcher and the research. In their contribution, Earle, Parmar, and Phillips provide an example on a methodological framework which strive to ameliorate such inequalities by engaging more ethically in the production of knowledge and of representations. Others, like Gabriel, offer through archival research ways to retrieve subversive knowledge of disenfranchised populations. Of course, we are conscious that we fall short of fully realizing the political aspirations of this project, in part because of the many material, cultural difficulties, inequalities, and obstacles that are at the heart of the volume and the work that goes in it. There is much more to be done to advance a global conversation on coloniality and the criminal question, crafted from marginal, peripheral, and southern viewpoints. And since the project of decolonization is active and political, we hope the chapters in this collection invite users and readers to see it as an ongoing project, something we might call a decolonizing horizon that must advance and evolve. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you very much, everyone. It was wonderful to hear your reflections on the collection and, of course, the insights you offered to us about how you put it together and the particularly rich contributions from individual authors. And I love the reflexivity of your kind of engagement with this discussion and, of course, with the project. Thank you very much. We now have some time for questions, and we have questions coming in on the YouTube chat. And we, of course, Chris and I have our own kind of engagements and thoughts. So perhaps we will start with your own.
Yeah. So
preliminary.
My question probably more relates to the conception and then the practice of putting this collection together. I think it's very valuable to have such broad perspectives from around the world, particularly in the sense that it allows us to problematize colonialism itself. I know, especially within my own context, we kind of get trapped within the domestic and that definitional method of the criminal law and how it's defining the criminal in that domestic setting, and trying to break through that, having those international examples all in one place really kind of lifts that lens higher. Just wondering, and Anna Chamberlen, you kind of touched on this a little bit in putting it together and having to branch out across the different and expand networks to find the contributors. Just wondering if we could reflect a little bit more on that process of trying to get those perspectives and those contributors when putting this collection together.
Yeah, sure. That's actually something we summarized briefly in the introduction of the collection. So once kind of the idea for putting together the book emerged, and it was very much kind of driven by Anna getting us all together, Anna Liversi getting us together to think about these issues. We put out a call for papers, and we received some really interesting submissions through that. But what happened was something that I think happens very often in collections of this nature, was that we received collections from several colleagues who worked mostly in the global north, and who were working in English-speaking universities predominantly. So we sought then to deliberately seek out more diversity for the collection. So we did a broad search for particular perspectives and contexts that were missing from the papers we received, and we identified authors that we were less familiar with ourselves, working in different disciplines and different areas of the world, and we invited them to contribute to the collection. So it was a bit of an ongoing process to get together the mix of chapters that we wanted to have in the collection. And I think an issue that we've kind of been tackling and been relatively kind of conscious of, I think, throughout this process is the issue of language as well, that we've had to deal with the domination of the English language as our working language. And also we had to be sensitive to the fact that for many of the authors in the collection, English wasn't their first language, and we had to offer kind of necessary support in that way, in sometimes at least. Yeah, I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that.
Well, thank you, Anna. I think that's very interesting, because one of the challenges, I think you mentioned it in your presentation, and Chris was gesturing towards, is about going beyond our networks, isn't it? And going beyond the kind of usual suspects that appear at these different things. While we're waiting for some questions to come in on YouTube, I'll jump in as well to follow along on Chris's question about the sort of the meta dimensions of the project, about bringing it together. One of the really interesting things I think is your capacity to reflect on the academic knowledge production in institutional life, in its disciplinary life, in a way that shows both the potentials of the kind of project that you have, but also the limits of criminological knowledge and traditions. And one of the things that I was interested in diving into the collection was about the place of the criminal law in that space. So one of the really interesting things I think that you're able to do in the collection is you're able to kind of resurface some of the traditions that have perhaps been overlooked or put to the side, and you put them together in different ways. So you draw back to Frantz Fanon and you think about the kind of post-war initiatives in critical spaces, and Maximo, you gestured towards this in your remarks just now. And that shows, I think, both the richness of the criminological tradition, but also the creativity of the way in which you all have approached the project. But it seems to me that the criminal law itself, within the institutions, within the practices, within the traditions, is something of a lacuna. And I wonder if you would be willing to reflect on that sort of provocation, deliberate provocation, because I suppose I'm thinking of the strictures and the limits of the criminal law scholarship, and particularly the legal philosophical tradition that dominates our criminal law scholarship, at least in the English-speaking world. Where's the critique of that dimension? Where is the space for the kind of doctrine and legislation, judicial practice, etc., in the kind of critique that you've set up? And particularly, perhaps, where is it in the future for future projects or for future initiatives? A big question, I know. I'm very interested in this for my own thinking about the future of the criminal law in the context of empire and imperialism, colonialism.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really, really interesting question. Just trying to reflect here on, I mean, I think the collection does offer many interesting reflections on, I guess, what we may call, which is a very fertile field of criminal law scholarship nowadays, which is the idea of criminalization, right? Mm-hmm. So I know just out of the top of my head, Lucy Harris's chapter talks a lot about drug laws being used in a very specific way in Malaysia to enforce processes of ordering and divides between the more, let's call, advanced perception that Malaysia wanted to promote of itself in relation to its neighbors, right? So many of Hugo Rodriguez Santos's chapter talks a lot about how the law has developed in Brazil in a way that has tried at the same time to promote a veneer of multiculturalism, whilst in practice segregating populations, racialized populations, right? So I think there's a lot of that in the collection, in how laws have developed in ways that perpetuate and that are deeply influenced by colonial and imperial debris. As for like more doctrinal matters, I guess, I mean, to some extent, all of these reflections we've been making are really important to this challenging of the dominant hegemonic understandings of how to do law as a discipline more broadly, but also criminal law in particular. Some other chapters like Omar Phoenix Khan's chapter on Brazil, although more focused on policing, talks a lot about the application of rules. So there's a lot of, I think the collection offers many reflections how this can be breached. And one thing that I've been doing, I guess, in my own work is to get many of these insights and to apply them more directly to, for instance, critical reflection on criminal responsibility or more specific discussions on laws like joint enterprise. So I think there's a lot of fertility there, and definitely, although the collection, it's true that I don't think out of the top of my head there is any chapter that deals with criminal law doctrine specifically. I mean, that's even perhaps a consequence of the way we frame the inquiry, right? We're looking at the criminal question as this issue that's necessarily hybrid and fluid and multifaceted and invited perhaps a more sociological, in that sense, orientation.
Yeah, I could add something that is not strictly connected with the contents of the collection, but I think that thinking on the context of Latin America, where I live and work, the decolonizing reflection in the field of criminology has been here in a way present since the 1980s. So many important researchers has introduced a problematization of the colonial legacies in a way or in another, but it was somewhat present in our reflection for quite a long period. But in the case of the criminal law theory, I would say that it's quite absent. It's exactly the opposite. And there are only a few exceptions. So we mentioned today, Anna mentioned this in the introduction, and then I did it also, this very important legal theorist in Latin America, Eugenio Raúl Zaffaroni, who was one of the few that I know that tried to, in some way, he took this problematization from the field of criminology in Latin America and tried to deploy it in the criminal law theory and try to produce some kind of, let's say, discussion in this direction. He has now 84 years, and he published a book just a month ago exactly on this, on the decolonizing question in criminal law theory. I am not a criminal law professor, so I could not, evaluate the success or not of his attempt, but at least it's the only example I have in my mind in our region in which you can see exactly this practice going on. But I think it's a fantastic topic, and we need more research on this. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Maximo, and thank you, Henrique, as well. I think that the great thing is that this is an example of how we might do that same work in another space. And of course, it connects to other work that's going on, Henrique, in your own projects, but also in other collections of which you're a part. And it seems to me to be a very good provocation for how we might think about that, given the sort of very particular kind of traditions of criminal law theory that have really, we can trace, their influence significant and dominant still. We have some time for questions now from those watching on YouTube, and we encourage you to pop your questions down for us, so we can turn to those when they come through. I'll jump in with another question while we're waiting for further for comments coming through. I thought one of the really interesting dimensions of the collection was actually the way in which the chapters reflected on each other. And you all in your presentations just now really captured that kind of interaction. And so, for instance, I think Amanda Wilson's chapter on therapeutic jurisprudence and its limitations in relation, despite its claims for cultural sensitivity, for example, its limitations, connects well to Chris Cunneen's work in relation to looking at the political processes of decolonization and abolition. And it seems to me that that's quite hard to achieve in an edited collection. And I wonder how you fostered communication between contributors. So another meta question about processes, but an interesting one, because of course part of what a collection like this does is introduce scholars to each other, right? And the way in which those kinds of potential connections can then grow into something else. Did you have a chance to share the collection with the contributors, or was this something that was sort of serendipitous or just perhaps coincidental amongst Australians? Please share your insights about how to achieve this in an edited collection, which is often quite a challenging herding of cats process.
I'm happy to. So this project had the unfortunate fortune of falling in the COVID kind of bracket, historical bracket, and that meant that any face-to-face interaction was impossible. But we had, we were lucky to have some kind of workshop where all the authors presented their chapters. I think, and that was really interesting as well, because we have discussants who reflected on groups of contributions. But perhaps this was one of the most challenging aspects of the project, because the invitation was quite broad, and we wanted to make it broad on purpose. And as Anastasia mentioned at the beginning, we tried different ways of opening it up through calls for papers and invitations and snowballing of contacts of people who knew other that were working on particular issues that we were interested to feature in the project. But I think one of the main challenges was to make the connections at the end in terms of different jurisdictions, different colonial traditions, different institutional scenarios that were the focus of the chapters. And one of the things that was really important for us as well is to have a kind of a one day kind of thinking about those connections together. And that was very productive, having that luxury of being able to think together through the different chapters. But it is an intense exercise, because it means, you know, having, you know, 18 chapters basically in your head, and kind of you know, we all have different levels of revisions and feedback to authors, which meant that we all knew about the whole
Thank
project.
you very much. Thank you, Anna. Yes, absolutely. And I think your strategy has worked well, because there's a very nice synergies across the papers. We have now, I think, just a few more moments. So this is your last chance if you're on YouTube and a question is percolating away. Please add it to us and we'll put it to the contributors. I suppose the logical question at this point is really about where to next. Has the collection kind of given you guys new research horizons, new possibilities in your own work? Has it made you reflect back on what you've done in the past in new ways? And I wonder if you've got a sense of where you might be taking this in the next step and working together again.
So I can say something just to I think that one of the main very interesting discussions throughout all the book is Henrique discussed it quite particularly in his intervention, is this question about how we think on this concept of colonial legacies that we have been using quite a lot, and in many of the intellectual production around the connection between colonialism and the criminal question, there is not a huge debate about how we are using this concept and how we can think beyond a simple idea of persistence that I think it is very present in the debate today. And I think that we can find, of course, examples of perfect persistence, but also we find many other kind of examples in what persists, also changes throughout time, through struggles, both anti-colonial struggles and even struggles that do not have an anti-colonial horizon, but also in some way impacted in that thing that has been constructed in the colonial past. And I think this is probably one of the most interesting discussions for the future. How if we want to continue to use a concept like this one of colonial legacy, how we cannot be trapped in an idea of continuous persistence of the past in our present, and we can really find out ways of making sense also of the metamorphosis of the things that were built in the colonial periods or experiences. I think this is one very important thing. And the other one is also how we avoid, and I think it's connected, how we avoid thinking on coloniality as something that came from the past. How we can introduce the new forms of colonialism that today we are experiencing in many different ways, and how we can transform this is an object of research. And I think that there are some chapters in the book that give us some inspiration to do it, but there is plenty of things to do in this direction.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Sorry, no, just wanted to say that I can completely agree, and I think that this point is really, I mean, I think to us it was central when we arrived at the conclusion, and to us, I think it was also very much an important avenue for future research to talk about this aspect, I guess, I think the term coloniality is very apt. That suggests that coloniality is not simply tracing the impact of the past on the present or anything like that, but it's about a field of social action, right? So that shapes the present in many different ways, in ways that, yes, are deeply influenced by the past, but that are reshaped, retaken, performed in different ways, and can transmute itself in quite significant ways, so that it gives rise to contradictory positions that can make it very difficult for us to discuss if we're only tied up to issues of past colonial oppression, which these histories are, even in critical scholarship, very often presented as very linear as well, right? And I think there's fantastic work done today in race theory that really emphasizes how race is an elusive category, a contested category, a very situated and relational category that can't simply be understood by maintaining our adherence to this normalizing and naturalizing conception that race is about, for instance, skin color or cultural prejudice or anything like that. Rather, the potency of race as a structure of oppression is that it's constantly being transformed, retaken, repossessed, right? Going under the covers, then re-emerging in political discourses, sometimes in an overt way, sometimes in a discreet way. And I think coloniality is to a large extent the same, at least as it's most productive. If our intention, it really is, I mean, a historical enterprise is very valuable, indispensable, but also if what we want is to decolonize, as it seems to be like a very important focus nowadays, then we need to understand, well, what we're decolonizing, that we're not simply, trying to recapture a moment of rupture and trying to understand its effects. That's part of the project too, but also to understanding really what are the pressures and the problems that we're facing today.
Yeah, I'd be cheeky, since we're hitting time, kind of wrap up with a comment of the impact this has on my own thinking on these kind of issues. And as I read the contributions in the book and now reflecting on the discussion, I'm personally particularly drawn to this question of how criminology and the criminal law articulates difference, deals with difference, because we have a early kind of making of space epistemologically for difference, but less space created ontologically. So particularly when we're operating in colonial contexts, for criminology and the criminal law to say, yes, these alternate worldviews have value, that they have an inherent legal order, and relationships might be built on parity rather than through subsuming. So, I mean, that's the thinking I take away from all of this. I think the collection is immensely valuable. So from me, well done in bringing it together, and for all the contributors.
Yes, absolutely. And I echo Chris's words, because it's really a fabulous collection, and a really rich and well put together collection, and your own contributions, both in the introduction, the conclusion, and obviously through your work with contributors, are clearly central to that. So we're both delighted to be diving in, and we look forward to further work from you as a team, and perhaps also to seeing what comes out in your own work from the kind of insights you've gathered from the collection. I certainly feel that you've set up a really wonderful model of how one might go about these kinds of projects in the future. And I think it's fabulous to see that you can see yourselves where the next steps might lie, metamorphosis, perhaps we could say, in overcoming methodological nationalism and other kind of next steps, which I think would be very exciting. It's been an absolute pleasure to be chatting about this collection, and you have all been absolutely wonderful contributors and collaborators today. We're delighted to be congratulating you on the appearance of the collection and wishing you all the best in the next steps.
Can I say something just before we break? So this is the book, but it's also open access, and so it's freely available from the Oxford University Press site. Anyone can download chapters from it. So, and this is part of the ethos of the project to make knowledge open.
Thank you, Anna. And that's a really good reminder about where you can find and dive into the collection. It's also, there's a link on the Modern Criminal Law review site as well. And I'm looking forward to seeing how we follow up with the kind of engagement that we've got today. So those who've been out on YouTube, please follow up with any of the contributors or with Chris and I, because we look forward to seeing how this can grow in the future. And a final word of thanks to Marcus for setting this all up, and to you all for your really enthusiastic engagement with this exciting meta discussion about the collection. Thank you.